And ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the podcast. We're doing episode 231.
You know, after so many podcasts we've been doing together, I've been wondering when we're going to run out of topics.
But we still haven't. Today we're going to be talking about the creative merit of reboots, specifically in movies. Now, what do you think that means?
Well, I imagine the question is, should we be continuing to make reboots? Like, is it worth it?
Exactly.
Or is that a cheap trick that directors are like backing off a previous franchise or a previous subject material that exists? Or can you offer something new?
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. Are reboots good when you hear the word reboot, or you're like, oh, that sucks right off the gate? Or are you excited every time you hear that they're rebooting something?
Just to be clear, this is not including sequels or prequels to things, right?
Yeah, so let's first define the difference between a reboot versus a sequel or a prequel. At least in my mind, a reboot means you're starting from scratch canonically, for the most part, right? As in, all the events of the previous franchise are like, the slate is wiped clean. You are starting new cast, new timeline, all that stuff. Versus a sequel is some form of a continuation, whether it has new characters or the same characters or whatever. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that seems right to me.
Right.
Do we want to list some examples?
So I list my favorite example, which is the reboot of Star Trek. Obviously, Star Trek is a 1960s sci-fi show and later became movies and all that stuff starring William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, all those people. But then when they rebooted it in 2009, it was brand new people playing the same characters. So there was a character named Captain Kirk, but it was no longer William Shatner. It was Chris Pine, and he was a rebooted, rebranded character who happened to share the same name.
However, it gets a little bit fuzzy.
In that franchise?
Yeah,
I do realize that
Leonard
might be a
Nimoy
confusing
is in there, right?
Example,
Is Leonard Nimoy? He's still Spock, right?
That is technically true. I chose a very confusing example because there is time travel involved, and they do imply that it is canonically. But
no, I know what you mean. I still think it's a good example.
Right. Another fresh example might be like the Robocop movie they made in 2013. You know, the 1980s Robocop with Peter Weller, that was its own thing. And then decades later, they decided to revisit it, rewrite the script, hire new directors, new actors. Everything is completely different, but it follows the same basic premise. I think that's a better example, though no one saw that movie.
Total Recall.
Oh, yeah, Total Recall. That's another
one.
example of a good reboot. Or a bad reboot.
Yeah.
It's a good example of a reboot, not necessarily it's a good movie.
So let's talk about it. I feel like we're on the same page. So
I agree. Let's just leave it at that.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. We're gonna end this podcast.
Now we know what they are.
Yeah, this is a 2-minute podcast where we define a word and then we move on.
Now that it's been defined.
Yeah.
The question is what? Is there merit?
Should we
in
still
reboots?
be making reboots at this point? Or are you in the boat where we've completely gone stale with ideas, and anytime we do a reboot, it means Hollywood has run out of creative juice?
Right. First of all, my answer is no, of course not. Of course you can still make reboots. I mean, I feel like the obvious answer is you have to offer something new. If you're not offering something new to the reboot,
then why do it at all?
Yeah. Which is interesting, because when I think of most reboots, I want to say that like they're not all that different.
It depends from the standpoint of you want to create something new, but at the same time, if you do something so new, people will be like, this isn't like the old thing at all, and then they get upset. So it's a fine line.
Right.
And everyone has a different line, so it's really hard to please. And I think a perfect example of reboots done, quote-unquote, wrong, of course, we're discussing opinions here, it's subjective, are the animated reboots of Disney movies turned into live action. I think those are good examples of reboots.
That are bad?
I'd say, yeah.
All right, tell me why.
Most of the public believe that those are bad examples of why reboots shouldn't happen, because I think exactly what you're saying. They go, we already saw the magic of Pinocchio in the 1940s, I think, in cartoon form, and now you're going to do the exact same thing, but now it's live action Tom Hanks instead.
Yeah, but you still bring like such a different tone
You'd
to the
think
world
so.
from live action and real people playing things.
That
it's
is
a whole
true.
different type of aesthetic and magic that you can bring to the table.
If you do it right. And I think a lot of people are saying they're not doing that. They're just translating what already worked in cartoon form and just filming it with real people and then calling it a new movie.
How would you do it differently?
That's the tricky thing. Is I think it is the balance of, you're gonna take like Mulan, for instance, and you're gonna try to rebrand it as this new, like, bigger, sexier live action movie almost. And yet what they did was they threw out the baby with the bathwater. They threw out all the magical comedic stuff and the musical stuff that made the first one great, and they rebranded it too hard, and it didn't make anyone happy. So I feel like it's finding that balance of, you want to find out first what made that first one actually good. It wasn't just because there was a character named Mulan. It was a combination of its parts, and you have to figure out, why do those parts work in the first place, and then maybe add on to it, if that makes sense.
I think so. You didn't tell me specifically how. I mean, it's quite a test, but like, what specifically would you have done differently to make
like with Mulan?
Yeah, to make Mulan better.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Because I haven't given too much thought about it. Did you see Mulan?
No, I didn't. Actually.
I did see it. I'd say most people fall into the same boat as me, where they watched it and were like, okay, this looked good. It visually looked good, but it brought nothing to the table, and actually left a lot of things at the old table. Because Mulan from 1998, I believe, was so popular because not only did it have a lot of heart, but it also still had a lot of comedy. You know, you had Eddie Murphy as Mushu, who's hilarious. You had some really memorable songs that still pop into my head too often, mixed with still a really grounded story about
Talking
war.
Dragon.
Yeah,
No,
yeah. I mean, you have fantastical stuff like Talking Dragons, and you have really grounded storylines involving the war in China and the Huns and all. And the Huns are like scary, and they're serious, and they are a threat. And then you have like a cricket who's really makes light of.
He's a flea, isn't he?
No, he's a cricket bug.
No, the cricket bug is the princess one.
No,
Or the Princess and the Frog.
no, it's Mulan. Yeah, I'm
Oh,
positive.
you're right. All right, yeah, you're right.
There is
You're
also
right.
Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio. But to say that's, in my opinion, what made Mulan great. It was this balance of all these tones, the fantastical, the comedy, and then the seriousness all blended into one.
And in the live action, did they...
And then the live action, they went, okay, we're going to really ground this thing.
But take out the things that people liked.
Yeah, like the characters. There's like no characterization. Mulan is a generic, static woman who pretends to be a man. So she does the thing that you paid your ticket for, but she has no personality. In fact, all of her surrounding characters have no personality. There's no really funny, like, fat bald guy. There's no guy who talks like this, or whatever his name was. There's no one with personality. And there's, of course, not that you need songs to make a good movie, but they took the musical aspect out of it too. And you're left with a very dry movie that has some cool war stuff in it, and like people are just in scenes because they have to be there.
Right. I mean, not to talk about Mulan for forever, but I mean, my guess
Welcome
is
back to the Mulan podcast, everybody.
But my guess is that that was intentional, and the idea was to make like a serious, grounded Mulan movie.
Right, which could be cool if they still leaned into character. You have to have character. Like, they definitely had the setting of a more grounded war movie, and they had some good stunts, and they have some great cinematography, but I don't understand the characters and why they're doing what they're doing necessarily, outside of very surface reasons.
So it was still not interesting to watch because of the lack of
character.
Yep.
If you reboot a movie that you think is good because of the concept, but you leave the lovable characters behind, then you're not going to have as good of a movie.
Yeah.
So what is your favorite reboot, you think?
Favorite reboot? Like, now that we're here, like, everything's blank in my mind. You'd have to come back to me. I mean, you just told me yours, which was Star Trek.
Star Trek.
If you just listed a bunch,
there are a lot of
James Bond. James Bond is actually a really good reboot.
That's a good example of a reboot. Although that's an interesting. Yeah, I guess you would call them a reboot.
Yeah. I'd say that's a pretty damn good one.
James Bond is a actually perfect example of the passing of the torch, and why I think reboots, yes, they do represent, in a way, depending how cynical you are, creative laziness. But at the same time, if you compare film to theater, which film basically is theater in modern day, more or less, go to like hundreds of years back where we only had theater, you would still pass around like the same classic Romeo and Juliet and Shakespearean plays and see a new director and a new cast bring it to life in a brand new way, depending on which city you saw it in, which month you saw it in even. I think that's like the origin of quote-unquote reboots.
It's just a different director's vision and style.
Because you could see Romeo and Juliet at your high school theater production in 2008, and then you could go in 2014 and see Romeo and Juliet in a local theater production that takes like a steampunk approach. And of course, brand new actors are playing Romeo and brand new actresses playing Juliet, and you get a brand new take using, in that case, the exact same script.
No, I'm pretty sure that's different, actually. I think they do use a different screenplay or script. Like Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella.
Well, yeah, there are versions of fairy tales where they rewrite it. Because there are different versions of like Romeo and Juliet turned into West Side Story, which is a reskinned,
which is another new reboot that came out.
Also true.
Steven Spielberg.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Westworld.
Yeah. And I think,
or not Westworld,
or West Side Story.
West Side Story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Although Steven Spielberg, Westworld would probably be
a lot of people
good.
don't know that Westworld is actually a reboot of West Side Story.
Yeah.
But they left out so much and added these robots.
They changed a lot, I'll tell you.
It really upset a lot of people. But I feel like that's, in a way, a cool way to look at reboots. Is it's like a passing of a torch. Like, oh, let's see what happens when you give a new director and a new cast a take on Robocop. And if you don't like it, oh, well, you still have the original. You know, they're not going back and burning the old DVDs. You know, that's kind of how I see it. A lot of people see whenever there's a new creative venture on a franchise that exists already, they say that they're destroying their childhood. And I understand that because they're extremely opposed to whatever quote-unquote terrible thing they're doing. But they're not going back in time and destroying the film reels of the original film that you know and love. They're adding to it, and you can take it or leave it.
At the same time, you can ruin a franchise by doing that.
Yeah.
I mean, we can take the MCU. I'm not that it's getting completely trashed. It doesn't have to do with the reboots, but with the new MCU movies coming out post Endgame, mostly, except for some of the shows like Loki and WandaVision, a lot of the things are not being received well by the public, and now it's kind of ruining the MCU franchise in the light of a lot of people.
I mean, it certainly does change your perspective as an audience member coming out of the theater of Endgame in 2019, and you're on top of the world, and then, you know, you skip forward now and you're watching like episode 5 of She-Hulk with a gun in your mouth.
Oh man.
And you're like wanting to like erase that because you remember how happy you were about the MCU viewpoint you had in your head in 2019, and now it kind of has been tarnished.
Yeah.
Depending on who you talk to. I know some people enjoy She-Hulk. We personally don't, but that's for another time.
We need to see a reboot of She-Hulk soon.
Oh, man.
Here's my question that I want to know. Would you, Caden, you're a director. Not a good one, but a director.
Fair.
Would you?
I go for participation.
Would you? And you get it every time.
Mm-hmm.
Would you do a reboot? Would you feel like creatively authentic making a reboot, or would you feel like you cheated a bit or something?
I think it depends. I feel like oftentimes a good reason to make a reboot, and this is a next good segue, technology. Oftentimes,
I was thinking that
you
too.
had a movie like Tron in early 80s or
1920s.
1920s. A lot of people don't know.
That's right.
Tron came out in 1923, looking at the Google now. But Tron in the late 70s had very, very limited technology, and yet at the same time...
82.
Oh, it was 82. Okay. Tron in 82 had some of the very first computer-generated imagery ever put into a feature film. Some of the first. I think it was beat just barely by young Sherlock Holmes, I believe. But in 1982, they tried to create a fantastic world of computers and programs and light cycles and put you into this brand new digital world. And, depending on who you talk to.
Boy, did they.
Yeah, if you watch it now, you're like, this doesn't age very well. Not that we're trying to criticize a classic. Tron did a lot of things. I'm going to be honest, when I watched it as a modern audience member, it doesn't hold up, And so when they revisited Tron with the new Tron Legacy movie in
2012 is my guess.
Or something around those
Let me
lines,
check.
I feel like that is a justified reason to revisit that movie because now technology's gotten so much more advanced that we with all our brand new CGI tactics and physical simulations and all this stuff, you can really approach the same story or in this case, continue the story with brand new visuals that really heighten the original concept.
Same with, I now have my answer from a favorite reboot. Because you remind me, Planet of the Apes. 100%.
Oh, okay. That is a really good answer.
And the originals honestly weren't terrible. I'd have to watch them again.
I've seen only part of an original, if I'm being honest. And it's from late 1960s, as I recall.
Yeah, that's wild. But the new ones are so fantastic. And in terms of story, character, and CG, and everything they did with the mocap for the monkeys and apes. They look so good. Like, you could get so much more expression. Like, that is a reboot that had a reason to make a reboot because of technology.
Right. And of course, technology doesn't do all the heavy lifting. You still need a good script and a director and all that
Andy
obvious
Serkis.
stuff. And Andy Serkis.
Andy Serkis did the heavy lifting on that one.
In the late 60s, they had, at the time, revolutionary prosthetics and makeup and make actors look like they were monkeys. But at the time, there's lots of limitations. For one, if you put a bunch of rubber, latex, and whatnot on an actor's face, you start to lose how much they're scrunching their eyebrows and their nose and their lips. They start to become more and more of a talking statue, and you lose a lot of the performance. And revisiting.
And they didn't really look like monkeys. Let's be real.
Yeah,
they looked like something else, but not a monkey.
Yeah. It's a little questionable looking back at it now. But now you can put like a million dots on someone's face, and the computer takes those dots and translates exactly what Andy Serkis was doing and right back at you in the form of a 3D character model. When done right, it is absolutely incredible. And I think that's a good example of let's take a story that was all apes, and people didn't want to touch that for a while because it kind of looked silly because it required lots and lots of makeup. We're at a point now, technology, where we actually might be able to create a live action looking CGI model of a chimpanzee. Let's dip our toes into this franchise.
And every day, Caden, you're beginning to look more and more like a live-action chimpanzee.
Which reminds me of the next project we're doing coming up.
Chimpanzees Returns.
Rise
at the Chimpanzees.
The Chimpanzees. That's right, folks. You heard it first. Title drop. On the topic of approaching a franchise when your technology is better is actually a good time to talk about when that is done incorrectly. For instance, when you have the technology to do something better, but that actually makes it worse. To quote Jurassic Park, which I think is a prime example of what I'm about to talk about, you were so concerned on whether you could, you didn't stop to think on whether you should. From the standpoint of 1993's Jurassic Park was a huge technological milestone in CGI because you had what looked like lifelike dinosaurs brought to life in CGI and oftentimes amazing animatronics. And they knew at the time that there were limitations, right? Which is why you didn't see the T-Rex just jump out and run around in the middle of the daytime all the time for 30 minutes, right? They hyped him up using lots and lots of tension, and then in very select shots showed him being silhouetted against this very moody lightning night scene and hidden in the shadows, and then every now and then popping up and mixing him with an animatronic. Nowadays, if you look at the new Jurassic Park movies, which do technically look good,
Yeah.
but they are missing the magic of the 1993 Jurassic Park, because nowadays they're hanging on these shots of dinosaurs for long, long periods of time, and the audience knows that they're looking at CG because you're showing so much of it to them all the time in various lighting environments where there's not a lot of contrast, and sometimes the shots look good, sometimes they don't. They're going for quantity over quality, and sometimes you should just hide a T-Rex in the shadows and every now and then silhouette him in lightning. Just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, I agree. I think what you're trying to say is just that like there was more intent
Yes,
because of
exactly.
the animatronics they had, and since now they just have CG, it's like, yeah, we can just do whatever the hell we want. Yeah, there'll be a big ass dinosaur there,
Right,
And
just
they'll
stomping
be
around.
stomping and chomping and bumping. I feel like another example too would be Alien.
Yeah,
And the new Alien CG looks fantastic for the Alien franchise.
I do agree, yeah.
But if we talk about like Alien 2 or Alien 3, I think Alien
Yeah.
3, which no one's really watched, but like some of the CG in that is, oof, it's rough. In the first Alien movie, oh man, it looks so
Because
good.
it's a literal guy in a practical suit, and in Aliens, the Queen is a huge animatronic on hydraulics, and what you're seeing on the monitor on that day on set is more or less what you're seeing when you pop that DVD in.
I mean, it's so textured and it's just right
There's
there.
weight to it.
And like when they did like they converted or switched to CG, like it just, I don't know. They're like, okay, now we can show all of the alien running around.
Yeah, and you
kinda,
can like show it jumping, you can show it side to side, and some of it looks good. I mean, we're not saying all of it doesn't, and it depends on the example, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. And
I'd love to see more practical things being used instead of. I mean, CG again is incredibly important and helpful, and there's some amazing stuff we can do with it. But I would love to see a little bit more of a comeback to the old
effects.
animatronics and practical
Yeah,
effects.
because there is a magic to it, because there's a tangibility that you lose when you're going digital. And, of course, there is amazing examples of CGI and things you could never accomplish practically. But, again, another reboot example that I think is great to touch on is The Thing. So John Carpenter's The Thing from 1981 is technically, a lot of people don't know this, a reboot from the 1960s film The Thing from Another World. But ignoring that, taking John Carpenter's sci-fi classic from 1981, The Thing, all of the effects are prosthetics and like really, really gross practical like guts and ooze and like fake heads that spider legs pop out of, and they're all wax models, and it's gross and amazing, and it's tangible because all of it was real in camera. And then in 2011, they decided to do kind of a soft reboot. It's technically a continuation, I believe. I forget what exactly it is, but it's them reapproaching The Thing, but this time with a lot of CGI. And a lot of the CGI looks good, but not nearly as good as the practical effects all the way back from 1981.
I agree. Now, the original like Japanese Godzilla and the dude in the Godzilla suit doesn't look fantastic, but the new Godzilla looks pretty badass.
Right. Sometimes
so-
a guy in a suit looks like a guy in a suit, and not in a charming way.
Yeah.
Sometimes you want the CGI model to bend and move their arms in an alien-like way that a human never could. And that's just one step closer to the illusion you're trying to create.
Yeah. So that was kind of like a big tangent on what you can do technologically speaking for reboots nowadays.
So you're asking me what reboot I would want to do.
Yeah.
So I was starting to say there's some movies that I absolutely love that regardless of being able to approach it with brand new technology, I think that doesn't matter. For example, if you take Robert Zemeckis' Back to the Future from 1985?
88.
No, that's the speed that he's going in his car, you idiot.
By the way, Tron was 2010, I checked.
Okay, all right, 2010. We're close. Back to the Future, even if you could cast like Tom Holland as Marty McFly, which I think he would do an amazing job, and you were to give brand new CGI for the time-traveling DeLorean with the crazy awesome sparks that fly out the back once it reaches 88 miles an hour, I wouldn't want to touch that movie because that movie in its own flawed way is perfect. And I would hate to ever reboot that movie. And in fact, Robert Zemeckis himself, who made all three of the Back to the Future movies, has basically said that he's never going to sign the rights away for anyone to ever reboot it. That's what he said.
Good.
So even though I'm a huge Back to the Future fan, even if studio came to me and was like, please, if someone actually came to me and was like, here's $100 million, I'll make a movie about Chimpanzee 2, Rise of the Chimpanzees. But honestly, I would creatively want to decline that because some things just shouldn't be touched. And that's why people do get upset when they take a movie that they already think is great and they hear that they're rebooting it. And you're like, why? Lion King was already good. Putting it in live action doesn't make any sense. But to answer your question, what would I want to reboot? There's a movie from the 80s about vampires in space called Life Force. And the movie isn't even good. I'm sure there's some diehard Life Force fans out there. Most people haven't heard of this movie for good reason. It's a bad movie made in the 80s, starring Patrick Stewart, believe it or not, about vampires in space. But the concept vampires in space is awesome, and I feel like that needs to be revisited in modern day. So that would be my answer, because there's not a lot of fans out there, but it is a pre-existing IP, and I would like to take a shot at a space vampire movie.
Fair enough.
Yeah, that's my answer. I'm sure I could come up with another one, but at this time, like if someone wanted to hand me the keys to Star Wars, I would rather give it to like a more capable director, because I feel like whatever I would come up with wouldn't be as good as like a J.J. Abrams. And I know some people hate J.J. Abrams' Star Wars movies, but I think he's great. But what's your answer if you had to reboot something?
That was a pretty good answer. I'm still not sure. I thought it was interesting that you said that certain things should not be rebooted at all. And the one that you cited for Back to the Future was true simply because you couldn't add anything, technologically speaking, talking about technology again, because it wasn't a movie that demanded anything
it really
that
wasn't.
it needed.
The majority of that movie was him walking around a back lot.
But then what other reasons? I mean, I imagine this. What was the vampire space movie called?
Life Force.
Life Force. I imagine that movie also suffered because of its lack of technology abilities. So is there other reasons why? And I imagine another good reboot reason would just because someone failed miserably.
Yeah.
And not technologically speaking, but like concept was good. The world they were living in was good, but like the character writing was just,
execution
was garbage.
Exactly.
And I'm trying to think about what that would be.
A good example of that is
Lord of the Rings.
Oh man, do you want people to hate us right away?
No,
we have a very controversial take on Lord of the Rings. We'll talk about it on episode 232 possibly. But yeah, that's a good example for instance, David Lynch's, I believe, Dune movie from the 80s. Was an instance which a lot of people are diehard fans of that movie, but it was an adaptation of the classic sci-fi book Dune, and it suffered from some budgetary, but more specifically technological limitations. And it was, received well from some Dune diehard fans, but it didn't really break out into the masses like, say, Star Wars. Whether you were a sci-fi fan or not, everyone went to see that movie. Dune, the fans of the book saw it and some other people, but it didn't really like make a huge box office splash per se, if I remember correctly. And then you go all the way forward to last year, Denis Villeneuve releases his reboot to Dune with like bone-crushing modern sound design and technological advancements and a brand new cast, and made a huge splash in the box office, and lots of people saw it, and it was very well received.
Yeah. That did that have to do with Dune being bad, like the original?
Yeah, I would say that a lot of people feel like that original 80s Dune kind of missed the mark. It has its cult following, but that wasn't necessarily a super popular movie if you compare it to other sci-fi movies that came out at the time, like Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi.
So this reminds me of another big one, of a movie that was done poorly, and not because of technology. Although the CG in the movie was pretty trash. And I'm talking about 2011's Green Lantern.
Of course, that's the answer I would give. Yeah,
so
rebooting Green Lantern.
The Green Lantern movie.
Yeah.
Now, that one is just a bad movie. It was just poorly done. Like, the villain was so one-dimensional and trash, and yeah, that would be a movie that could be rebooted. I think we could do such a good. There's so many different ways to do it, and I know you know more about Green Lantern than I do.
I mean, I'm a huge Green Lantern
There's
fan.
so many different types. It sounds so dumb saying it out loud. So many different types of lanterns out there.
There's red lantern,
and it's such a cool
lanterns.
concept to go off of. Caden, explain the concept of the lanterns.
Oh, well.
Briefly.
I mean, in my opinion, what makes Green Lantern so great is that each faction of the different lanterns, because you got red, yellow, blue, every color of the rainbow, each one is designated to an emotion. You have red is rage, orange is greed, yellow is fear, and each person decides to live their life based off that one emotion, more or less, and that's why that ring chose them.
And that's such a good character study, and
it's
like
a
study
psychological
on humanity, about just diving into that human emotion. And I would do it
in the form of a space opera.
Yeah, and I would do it in a human way, in the most human way possible. Is let's realistically look at what it would look like if we devoted like our life to this one emotion, and that's what ruled our every action and our thoughts that we had. And then, of course, you still get the spectacle that comes from a superhero movie, but with like a real interesting message to say.
Yeah. And that brings us to another really good topic on reboots, is the danger of reboots sometimes is you take a reboot that, like you're saying, had a good possibility, but ended up failing in execution. And then, 12 years go by, and Hollywood decides to revisit it, and they go, "Oh, a new Green Lantern movie is coming out," and average audiences go, "Oh, they made a really shitty one in 2011. Why would I want to see this one?" And then they don't go see it, and that's something that, like, for example, Life Force, which is not considered very good in the 80s, you walk past a poster in 2022 for Life Force, and they go, "Oh, that shitty movie from the 80s," and no thanks, just because it's associated with a movie that was bad. And that's, I think, exactly what happened with the new Suicide Squad movie. Because they made that Suicide Squad movie in, 2014 or something, directed by David Ayer.
16.
Oh, you might be right. And it was considered not that great. And then they kind of had a soft reboot of it, directed by James Gunn 2 years ago, which I thought was great. Most people thought it was great. It had really good reviews, but it made almost no money.
A lot of people didn't go to watch it.
And of course, a lot of that could be blamed by the pandemic. But at that point, we were out of the pandemic low, and movies were making money again. But I think, and a lot of people speculate, it's not just my hot take, that because it was associated with Suicide Squad just a mere 5 years before, people went, "Oh, I already saw that. It wasn't that good." And they walked right past.
Yeah, and I think that's way harder for movies released back-to-back for reboots. Like, if you wait 30 years, I think people are more likely to go.
Right.
But
Versus
if it's
Spider-Man.
but if it was like 6 years ago, it's like, oh, this was 6 years ago. This is the modern times. We have the same. We should have been able to do it 6 years
Right.
ago. If we couldn't do it then why are we able to do it now? But
Yeah.
but with that huge time in between of like 30 years, 20 years, it's like, okay, I bet we can do something new with it.
And that's exactly how I think audiences felt when they made Spider-Man 3 in 2007, I believe. And then in 2011, Amazing Spider-Man came out, or 2012. And people were like, didn't we just do this?
Yeah.
Again, like what you're saying, if you couldn't make a good Spider-Man movie, 7 years ago, why do you want my money for a ticket for a new one?
I do wonder if a lot of reboots are just cash grabs.
Yes.
Like I have a hard time believing that argument for a lot of things because like I just know just from what I've watched that directors put their heart and soul into making the movie that they're doing, and like I can't imagine that it would be a director's idea to do a cash grab movie.
Right. I mean, oftentimes it is the studio.
It'd be the studio, yeah.
And at the same time, I mean, yes, filmmaking is a business, and you have the top people who are running the industry are the businessmen, but they do go and hire very passionate, creative people to execute said quote-unquote business plan. At least most of the time. Of course, you can always get a bad director phoning it in. But typically speaking, yes, the studio head might greenlight the reboot that you think is a cash grab, and probably is, but then they pass it down to someone in the director's chair who hopefully and in theory is actually very passionate and going to give it his or her creative all.
Right.
So I say most people, when they hear the word reboot, they associate that with cash grab.
I wonder, this isn't a hot take or anything, but that just makes me think about the studios in general. Like,
you got a hot take? Got a hot take about studios?
Are they always trying to do cash grabs, or are the studios ever like, you know what? I would love to see this movie being made. I want to see it happen. Like, do they get pumped up? Do they get stoked?
I mean,
who knows?
It's hard to say. I mean, because obviously we don't know
it
a
is
lot
a
of
business.
Big studio heads. But yeah, I mean, the big studio heads, they are the businessmen. But at the same time, I mean, you'd like to think that there's a reason that they became the businessmen of a movie studio and not the business.
Because they care about the arts.
Yeah, they didn't become businessmen of like a computer company. They somehow landed in the entertainment industry, which implies at some point they did have a creative tick in them, right?
Right.
Whether it's gone now is the question.
And also, not all studios are the ones that are coming up with ideas.
Yes.
Like some directors are coming to studios being like,
that's also true.
Please let me make this.
Yes, that is a good point. It does go both ways. But typically speaking, the big studio heads are the more business-minded people, as they should be. It's unfortunate. As an audience member, you would wish that the studio would just put content that you personally want to see first, but they're going to put content that the masses want to see first because they need to make a return.
And making a movie is so goddamn expensive.
Yes, it is. Yeah, if they're going to blow $200 million on something,
you're going to want to ensure you get that money back.
Yes, which is so much why they rely on reboots, because it's a pre-existing intellectual property. Audiences already are familiar with it in some form or fashion, and immediately, if they're scrolling through the newspaper, no one reads newspapers anymore. If they're scrolling through their Facebook timeline,
through the newspaper.
Yeah, they're scrolling through the newspaper, and they see the word Robocop. They don't have to also read the logline because they instantly remember what Robocop is. It's a shorter amount of time to get an audience hooked because they already know what it is.
Yeah, and that's a huge thing for entertainment in general, is piggybacking off of content that people know about.
Yes.
This is a terrible example, but the first thing I thought of was the new Tubi original of the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp case.
That's right. In case you haven't heard, they literally just released a biopic of the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard defamation trial.
Yeah, and I'll let you watch the trailer for yourself.
It doesn't look good, is the implication there.
But previous, knowledge of previous knowledge of previous content is is really important
It's
and
so
something that people
helpful.
piggyback off. And that's true for anything. If you have like a pop star who's going to star in your movie, that's big because
Right.
you've heard of them before and they'll bring you. But like,
Precisely.
Yeah.
If you've never heard of what movie you're selling, but you have Leonardo DiCaprio in it, it's like, oh, I know that guy.
good enough for me.
Yeah. Any sort of familiarity that Hollywood can tap into, they will. And they should. I mean, that's a good, quote unquote, business plan.
Yeah.
However, it is sad. Both of us are, quote unquote, content creators and trying to make films. I mean, we don't have Leonardo DiCaprio's cell phone number. We don't have access to the Robocop rights, So when we want money to make something, we have no cards to play, and yet we want to play with the big boys. But because we don't have those things, it's much harder. So you really have to get sometimes maybe experimental or do something really crazy that no one's ever seen. And that's where really intense art house indie films come from. Because it's like, well, shit, we have to do something. Let's make a 2-hour-long movie about a dog who makes friends with a crocodile, and it's rated R for some reason. And then, something shocking, like Blair Witch Project. Let's make a movie where the whole movie actually looks like garbage, and it looks like it's found footage. And then they invented that, and everyone was like, oh, shit, I've never seen this before. Does it have anyone I know in it? No. Is it something I've never seen before? Yes, and they went and saw it. That's how crazy movies like that come out.
And that's the difficult thing about, the indie market is that you don't have the budget to do the crazy things that are different. Like when you think of something like, all right, I'll do something crazy. This whole world takes place on a rock space planet where all the trees are bananas.
Yeah, that's cool.
Like
I was actually just thinking of a movie like that. It's weird that you said it.
Really?
Yeah.
But you can't make that because you don't have the budget for it. So like you're stuck with the budget restraints that you have, but trying to make something that's never been seen before, that is a challenge.
Yeah, it is a challenge. And at the end of the day, hopefully creatives everywhere, and us included, yes, we are thinking, what's going to get us noticed? What's going to get the audience clicking our video or clicking rent or buy or hopefully seeing the movie in the theaters? At the end of the day, the main thing we should really be thinking about is what interests
I like it?
us. Yes, what are we passionate about? And cross your fingers and hope that other people are interested too. Because that's the only thing you really can do. Is if you're going to make a movie just thinking about what do audiences want to see right now, and then that's where your mind's at when you're writing the script or on set directing your actors. Yes, that can sometimes be a good guiding principle if you're like a producer, but at the end of the day, if you're making works that you personally are passionate for, hopefully people will see that passion shine through.
Yeah, unless your tastes suck.
Yeah,
Then we've got a problem.
That is the danger, and my taste sucks very frequently. So that's the tricky thing. And that's exactly what JJ said. Just using him as example for when he was given the new Star Wars movie, not exactly a reboot, but years later in 2015, he was given the keys to Star Wars to direct The Force Awakens, and he said in an interview, like, yes, I sat down and thought of all the things that the fans and the audience expects and wants and probably demands to see in this movie. And he started, writing a list and doing all that stuff. And then he realized eventually, if I direct this entire movie with just that lens, my heart's not going to be in this. At the end of the day, yes, I need to think about what the fans want. But more than anything, I'm just going to think about what movie do I want to make and let that be my guiding compass. And I think that's a really good way to approach anything.
Unless you hate that movie.
Yes, that's true.
Which I don't. We're bringing up way too many controversial opinions.
Yeah,
on
that. What, you hate The Force Awakens?
No, I don't. But a lot of people do, unfortunately.
Yeah. And some people's critiques actually, ironically, is exactly that, is that the whole movie felt to them like just a rehash of A New Hope and that it was just fan service. I understand to a certain extent, but I disagree. But yeah, final thoughts about reboots, wrapping this up here.
Right. I think they're good. They certainly can be. You just gotta offer something new. I do think that technology is a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
Technology, or if the movie's shit, then
Yep.
you can make a reboot.
And then start over. Yeah, there's lots of movies that I'd love to see rebooted. I think the early 2000s movie Doom, based off the video game,
Yeah. That'd be cool.
starring Carl Urban and Dwayne The Rock Johnson. That's a movie that could be so awesome because that game is so metal and so crazy. It's about demons from Mars. I mean, that should be enough. And somehow they really took a shit on it in the 2000s. I'd love to see that rebooted. There's a handful of movies that I think lots of people, despite claiming they hate reboots, I think would like to see another approach at.
Are we getting tired of reboots, though? I mean, maybe more like sequels and prequels and spin-offs to things is more what I'm getting a little tired of. I am starting to get to a point where it's like, I want to see
New things.
new franchises and new things that aren't based off of a previous lore.
Yeah,
or
I mean,
thing.
playing the devil's advocate, a lot of people also, and they're not wrong, but they say, nowadays, everything's just a spin-off or a sequel or a reboot. I miss the old times where everything was new. And they are right to a certain extent, but if you go all the way back to just OG Hollywood, like 1950s monster movies and 1940s, or I might have my timeline wrong. The moment they made the movie Frankenstein, there was like Frankenstein 2, The Bride of Frankenstein, Frankenstein versus the Invisible Man, Werewolf versus Frankenstein. Like there really is, the moment there was a successful movie in Hollywood, immediately, if you actually like look at the Wikipedia, the movies that you know and love, they actually have like a really shitty sequel you never heard about.
Yeah, I mean, they've always been there.
Yeah, they always have been.
70s,
Maybe,
80s, 90s.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hear about them now more because we're plugged into media more than ever. But there has always been sequels and reboots and prequels and spin-offs because that's just part of the Hollywood model that will probably never die. Maybe it should, but it probably won't.
Now, if done well, we want to see more.
Yeah, I think so too. I really do. But I think that sums it up for our conversation on reboots. Any final closing thoughts?
Yeah. When are we gonna reboot Life Force?
That's
Coming
a good
soon.
question. Yeah, our reboot to
2024.
Life Force is on the horizon. We will be working on that as fast as we can. If you want to just send us some money in the mail, we will take it. Not saying that we'll put it to Life Force, but we will take your money. So
Yes, thank you for your donation.
yeah, who knows where it's going, but we need the cash.
Yeah, go watch Planet of the Apes. Good reboot.
Yeah.
And Star Trek.
Yeah. All right, everybody. Signing off. I'm Caden Butera.
I'm Rylan Butera.
And this has been episode 231 of our Mulan podcast.